January 10th, 2000. Two men shake hands in front of a wall of cameras. Steve Case, the founder of a dial-up internet company, and Gerald Levin, head of one of the biggest media empires on Earth, announce a merger worth $182 billion. It is, by dollar value, the largest corporate deal in American history. They call it the future of media. Reporters call it a marriage of the old world and the new. Within 3 years, it would be remembered as something else entirely. The worst merger ever made, a deal that helped produce the single largest annual loss any American company has ever reported. But to understand how it all fell apart, you have to go back to the beginning, to a small startup outside Washington, D.C., that once mailed a free computer disk to nearly every household in America. In 1985, a company called Quantum Computer Services set up shop in Vienna, Virginia. It was founded by Steve Case, Jim Kimsey, and Mark Serif, and it did something unglamorous. It sold access to a network of online bulletin boards, chat rooms, and email, one dial-up connection at a time. Within a few years, it renamed itself America Online. Nobody outside the industry paid much attention. Getting online in the early 1990s meant a modem, a phone line, and patience. Most Americans had never touched the internet and had no reason to start. AOL's bet was that they would if someone made it simple enough. So the company built software that looked friendly instead of technical, organized the internet into folders and buttons a total beginner could follow, and gave the whole experience a personality. It introduced a small sound effect that would become one of the most recognizable audio cues in American life. 3 words, spoken by a synthesized voice, every time a new message arrived. You've got mail. It was so embedded in the culture that by 1998, it gave its name to a major Hollywood film. But the real engine of AOL's growth wasn't the software. It was the mailbox. AOL printed millions upon millions of free trial discs and sent them everywhere. Magazines, cereal boxes, literal doormats. At the campaign's peak, it's often said that a huge share of all CDs manufactured in the world at one point were AOL-installed discs. Most were never used for their intended purpose. People made coasters, frisbees, and even bird feeders out of them. But enough people put the disc in the drive, dialed in, and stayed. By the late 1990s, AOL was not just an internet company. For a huge slice of the American public, it effectively was the internet. The only address they knew, the only browser they trusted, the dial tone and screech of a modem handshake that meant the world was now available to them. Parents who had never touched a keyboard learned to navigate through AOL's colorful menus. Teenagers spent hours in its chat rooms. An entire generation's first experience of email, of instant messaging, of browsing anything online, happened inside AOL's walled, friendly interface. By 2000, AOL had roughly 30 million subscribers and was the largest internet service provider in the United States. Wall Street treated it accordingly. The stock had ridden the dot-com boom to extraordinary heights, and AOL, a company that had started by mailing plastic discs to strangers, now had a market valuation that rivaled century-old industrial giants with real factories, real revenue, and real profits going back generations. That valuation, built substantially on future promise rather than present earnings, was about to become a weapon. Steve Case looked at his inflated stock and saw an opportunity that wouldn't last forever. Use it, while it was worth a fortune on paper, to buy something with permanent, tangible assets. Something with cable networks, magazines, movie studios, and a music business. Something like Time Warner. In January 2000, the two companies announced their merger. At roughly $182 billion, it was the largest in American corporate history, creating AOL Time Warner, a company valued at around $350 billion combined. Case and Time Warner's Gerald Levin stood together and called it a merger of equals, the internet and old media joining as partners to build the future of the entire industry. For one single afternoon, it looked like the smartest deal anyone had ever made. The merger closed in early 2001, and almost immediately the cracks began to show. The deal had been priced and structured at the absolute summit of the dot-com bubble, when internet stocks traded on hope and future potential rather than earnings. That bubble began deflating within weeks of the announcement and kept deflating through the year. AOL's stock, the currency Case had used to buy Time Warner, was losing value fast. And so was the inflated logic behind the entire transaction. But the timing of the bubble bursting was only half the problem. The other half was cultural. Time Warner was built around magazines, cable channels, film studios, and record labels, institutions with editors, unions, decades of internal hierarchy, and a particular idea of what quality and prestige looked like. AOL was a scrappy, sales-driven access provider that had grown by mailing plastic discs to strangers and had a reputation, fair or not, as something closer to a mass-market utility than a media brand. Executives from each side distrusted the other almost immediately. Time Warner's media veterans reportedly saw AOL's people as pushy salesmen, thin on institutional weight, and undeserving of the outsized valuation the deal had handed them. AOL's people saw a bloated, slow-moving bureaucracy incapable of operating at internet speed. The promised synergy, cross-promotion between magazines and websites, shared technology, one company's content flowing seamlessly through the other's pipes, never materialized in the way both sides had pitched to investors and to each other. Committees were formed, plans were drafted. Very little of it translated into new revenue. Meanwhile, the ground underneath AOL's actual business was shifting permanently. AOL's entire empire had been built on dial-up access, modems, phone lines, and that distinctive screeching handshake sound. But broadband internet, delivered through cable and DSL lines, was becoming available and increasingly affordable, and it made dial-up feel instantly obsolete. Why wait for a page to slowly load over a phone line when a cable connection could deliver it almost instantly? Broadband providers, many of them ironically owned by the very cable companies now sitting inside AOL's own newly merged corporate family, began pulling subscribers away one by one. The company that had built its entire identity on being the easy, friendly on-ramp to the internet was now, technologically, the slow lane. Millions of people who had once needed AOL to get online no longer needed it at all. They had other, faster paths in, and no particular loyalty to the brand that had once been synonymous with going online. AOL had been so dominant for so long that almost nobody inside the merger seriously planned for what would happen once its core business stopped growing. The entire deal had been built on the assumption that AOL's momentum would keep compounding indefinitely and that its stock would keep climbing toward whatever number the future demanded. Instead, the stock was falling, the subscriber base was starting to erode for the first time in company history, and two corporate cultures that had never really agreed on anything beyond the press release were now legally bound together, indefinitely, for better or worse. By 2002, the numbers could no longer be disguised. AOL Time Warner reported a loss for the year of approximately $98.7 billion, the largest annual loss ever recorded by an American company. Much of that figure came from writing down the value of the AOL side of the business. An admission on paper that the internet division the whole merger had been built around was worth a small fraction of what the company had claimed it was worth just 2 years earlier. It wasn't a market correction. It was a confession, printed in the company's own official filings for anyone to read. The fallout moved quickly. Gerald Levin, the Time Warner chief who had stood next to Steve Case and called this a merger of equals, stepped down as CEO in 2002. Not long after the deal's true cost became impossible to hide. Steve Case, the founder who had built the entire company from a Virginia startup into the biggest name in consumer internet, held on as chairman a while longer, but the goodwill and internal power he had spent nearly 2 decades accumulating evaporated fast once the merger he had engineered became shorthand for corporate disaster. He resigned from the board in 2003. That same year, the company quietly dropped AOL from its own name, rebranding simply as Time Warner, a symbolic admission that the internet half of the business, once the entire reason the deal existed, was now something the company wanted to distance itself from rather than promote. The technological problem never went away either. While executives fought over blame and boardroom seats, broadband adoption kept climbing across the country, and AOL's dial-up subscriber base kept shrinking. There was no single moment where AOL could have reversed it. No missed press release or bad quarter that, fixed, would have saved the business. Dial-up was a technology whose time had simply passed, and the company that had built an empire on the sound of a modem handshake had no real answer for a market that no longer wanted one. For years afterward, AOL limped along inside the larger company as a shrinking, increasingly awkward division. Still profitable for a while off subscribers who hadn't gotten around to canceling, but no longer central to anyone's strategy, and no longer the reason anyone paid attention to the stock. The merger of equals had quietly become a story about one partner's slow disappearance. In 2009, Time Warner finally cut the cord for good, spinning AOL off as its own independent public company again, just as it had been before 2001. It was less a rescue than an admission that the marriage had failed completely and that both sides were better off separated. At the time of the spin-off, AOL was valued at only around $3.5 billion, a staggering fall from the tens of billions its stock alone had been worth at the moment the merger was announced less than a decade earlier. What survived was a much smaller company wearing a once legendary name. The AOL that emerged from the 2009 spin-off still had subscribers, still had the old brand recognition, and still had that chime lodged permanently in American popular memory. But it was a fraction of the empire it had once claimed it would become when it stood on stage with Time Warner in January 2000. It was eventually bought by Verizon in 2015, folded into a media division alongside other assets, a quiet corporate footnote for a company that once tried to redefine the entire media industry in a single afternoon. Time Warner, for its part, went on to be acquired itself years later, its constituent pieces scattered across the media landscape in later corporate reshufflings entirely unrelated to the AOL chapter. Gerald Levin later expressed public regret about the deal, at one point apologizing for the damage it caused to shareholders and employees, a rare moment of a former CEO openly disowning what had once been called his signature achievement. Steve Case moved on to other ventures, including investing in startups far from the media business, and largely let the AOL Time Warner deal stand as a cautionary case study taught in business schools rather than something he tried to defend. The lesson of AOL isn't simply that a big merger failed. Big mergers fail constantly, quietly, without becoming legend. What made this one historic was the timing and the arithmetic. A company used wildly inflated, bubble-era stock as currency to buy hard, real-world assets on the assumption that its own soaring valuation was permanent and that two fundamentally different corporate cultures would sort themselves out later. The bubble popped almost the moment the ink dried. The technology AOL was built on became obsolete within a few short years, and the culture clash that got waved away in the press conference turned out to be the whole story. AOL didn't fail because dial-up disappeared. Every technology eventually gets replaced. It failed because it spent its one moment of maximum leverage buying permanence with a currency that turned out to be temporary. The disk in the mailbox is a punchline now. The merger is a case study. And the chime that once meant the world was opening up to you now just means it's 2000, and nobody in that boardroom saw what was coming.